was because in more recent times, psychedelics have sort of been touted as the saviour, and it's, they're amazing, they can save humankind, they can cure this, they can cure that, but actually a lot of the dangers haven't sort of, they've fallen out of kind of discussion. And that's what we wanted to sort of delve into today. And the speakers will position themselves in relation to this topic. I'm really excited to hear this. So I'll hand over to Rob Dickins, who is our moderator. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amy. And can everyone hear me?
Oh, there we go.
There we go, brilliant. So wonderful to see so many lovely people here today, and I'm very honoured to be moderating this panel. It's safety and harms are all pervasive in psychedelia, and as things become more medically corporatized, as personal experiences rise, these conversations become more and more important. We've got four brilliant speakers today to discuss it. We have Ed, Anna, Tehseen, and Ashleigh. So the way we're going to do it is everyone's going to have 5 minutes each to sort of introduce who they are and their interest in this topic, and then I'm going to have a few questions for them all, and then we're going to throw it out to all of you. So please write down or consider anything that comes to mind as we're having a discussion, and as Amy said, please do keep it concise and brief. It would be very, very appreciated. So I'll begin by handing over to Anna. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Rob, and hi, everyone. So my name is Anne Schlag. I'm head of research at Drug Science, the charity founded by Professor David Nutt in 2010 upon his sacking of the ACMD, the Advisory Committee of the Misuse of Drugs. Within Drug Science, we do obviously loads of work, and if you're not familiar with us, please do check our webpage as well. One of the most areas that obviously is key to our discussion today is the work we're doing within our medical psychedelics working group, where we really have a consortium of the experts in psychedelics, together obviously also with patient representatives, policy advocates, some of them are here obviously today as well, and a consortium of industry partners. Okay, sorry, thanks. I feel better. So, and I think one thing I wanted to highlight from is one of the outputs. We did lots of works in relation to safety and benefits assessment, as well as harm reduction and reduction of stigma as well in relation to psychedelic medicine specifically. So much so we had a large research paper out earlier this year, available open access, on the adverse effects of psychedelics. This focus, I should say, on the classic psychedelics, so in this case excluding MDMA and ketamine. And within this paper, we really looked at the both physiological and the psychological harms of psychedelics. And we left out at that time, just because it is a scientific paper per se, any of the kind of ethical harms and wider social societal harms related to the commercialization of psychedelics and so on, which hopefully we'll be discussing in this panel. So really, just to sum up the paper very, very briefly and our outcomes, we looked at really the psychedelic research since the 1950s, which really in total has about thousands upon thousands of participants, mainly in the LSD research from the earlier decade of research, and we looked at the adverse effects. And obviously, this related to whether it's neurotoxicity, overdose risk, abuse liability, and dependence, and so on. And we found in generally that, as most of you will be aware, these physiological risks within psychedelics, within the normal dosage, are very, very rare. That's not to say they never occur. We were able to find at certain case studies where actually certain overdoses occurred in relation to also LSD. So I'm not here to say there are no harms in psychedelics, but they are, especially when administered in a clinical context, very safe from what we can gauge so far. And also looking at the non-clinical context, which obviously is really the majority of psychedelics used so far, there are also very rare occasions of serious adverse events occurring. Having said that, obviously they might well be underreported because of the legal status of psychedelics, as we all know. So one of the harms I would also like to highlight is really the harm of the drug policies, not just psychedelics, that obviously goes further. Obviously goes further as well, but a lot of the harms, especially also in the non-clinical context, might well be related to the drug policies that we have, that psychedelics are a Schedule 1 drug, apparently without any medical value. It's still quite a challenge and very expensive and time-consuming to research them. And people who might be in a non-clinical context and experiencing adverse effects might not feel able or confident enough to really look for medical advice after, because obviously they've done something illegal, so to say. So one of the key things that we also do in drug science is really looking into rescheduling psychedelics here in the West, that they can actually be recognized and used and prescribed as a medicine. So, do I still have time, or is that too long, I think?
No, that was absolutely spot on. Thank you very much. We'll pass over to Ed.
Hello, everyone. So my name's Ed Prideaux, and I'm a master's student and journalist. I live in Brighton, and I've been interested in psychedelics for about 7 years. And I began using LSD around, I would say, at the first sproutings of the plant of the psychedelic renaissance, so to speak, when you saw the first handful of clinical trials coming out. I remember I was especially influenced by NUT 2010, the MCDA, which suggested, along with other things, that psychedelics were extremely safe. And I consumed psychedelics with my friends under a general impression that these were non-toxic, non-addictive, and genuinely, from the perspective of the articles that we were reading, safer than having a few beers. And then after my 4th trip on LSD, I had something of a rude awakening when, a few days later, I began noticing that certain visual effects weren't going away. And now, 7 years later, I still live with the visual effects of quasi-psychedelic visual effects, broadly categorized under a disorder known as hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. And this goes along with a dissociative disorder I developed after a subsequent LSD experience, a sort of ego dissolution experience when I was 20. And then, over the course of reading online about HPPD, doing my own research, speaking with others about the condition, I began realizing that some broad experience of sustained visual effects, dissociation, depersonalization, existential OCD, an inability to return to reality, this sort of broad spectrum of effects isn't necessarily extremely rare. And there's a famous survey, or at least in the HPPD world, done in 2011, which suggested that debilitating visual effects after psychedelics, aka HPPD, affects as many as 1 in 25 of a sample of 2,500 long-term psychedelic users. And at the time when I first read this, I thought this was extraordinary, clearly far too prevalent. But then when you see the quantity of people reporting these effects, when you speak to people in the community, and you see that some form of visual effect isn't necessarily uncommon, but at the same time, I began speaking to others who reported these visual effects, and I saw that the clinical pathological model for these effects, i.e. viewing these as visual disturbances, or dissociation as, dissociation, depersonalization, a pathological weakening of your ego structure, etc., that these aren't necessarily helpful. And then seeing, and what Anna said really resonated, that a lot of the harms weren't just from the aftershocks of the psychedelic experience itself, but the world I returned to, which is a world still profoundly governed by prohibition, when developing difficulties with psychedelic experience is not something that my parents or teachers or mentors or loved ones could particularly receive or be open to conversations about. And above all, I suppose, I'd like to destigmatize something like a conversation about the wide-ranging experiential possibilities after psychedelics. And I want people, and especially with this issue of HPPD, because it seems to be on something of a spectrum, where on the one hand you have people that have minor visual effects that might initially disturb them and shock them, especially because these kinds of things aren't discussed. They're considered extremely rare when they aren't necessarily. And they're considered necessarily to be pathological, but they don't have to be. And then on the other hand, you have people that are genuinely, and for lack of a better term, almost disabled by the intensity of their visual effects. I was recently reached out to by a friend of mine from primary school who I'd not seen since I was 11, and he came across my writing on HPPD, and he told me that he also has HPPD and this dissociative disorder from LSD and the PTSD from an LSD trip. And he told me some of the stories of his friends who also had visual effects, and I was frankly stunned by the intensity of some of their visual effects. And some of the stories you read online of these poor souls who have been utterly, I don't know what the appropriate verb is, but their lives have been ruined. And I think that there is far more opportunity, and I'm optimistic, frankly, about where the psychedelic renaissance is going. Because there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of talk of the promise of these drugs, which I'm sympathetic with, but there also seems to have been something of a pushback, and this panel itself is suggestive of this pushback and a balancing in attitudes. And I hope to do my best with the charity that I work for, called the Perception Restoration Foundation, which was started by others who have been racked by visual effects after psychedelics, to try and create awareness and research into the condition.
Brilliant. Really interesting. Thank you very much, Ed. Pass over to Tehseen. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So, hi, everyone. My name is Tehseen Noorani. Thanks so much to both of you. I feel like we've already covered a lot of ground. It's really interesting. It makes me think of the role of transformative experiences within a world that is in many ways like deeply sanist, deeply normalizing, deeply pathologizing of things that aren't considered normal. So I come to this panel as a social scientist researcher. I've been working within the sort of psychedelic the knowledge production sphere, the kind of clinical work, and also commenting on the kind of clinical resurgence of psychedelic research for a while. I think the biggest danger, when I was thinking about dangers, because we were asked to do that for this panel, is sort of when all the oxygen gets sucked out of spaces and discussion around these very issues. And that happens when people come in with extremely strong claims or frameworks, or and I think in terms of the science, what amounts to a lot of scientific hubris around, the cure or whatever. And I think that, to me, that's one of the biggest dangers. And so in that sense, I'm really glad that we're here, and I hope we kind of can get into some of the nuance and the mess of some of this stuff. I think another danger is that when this stuff gets scienced and puts through the kind of clinical frameworks and machinery, we start talking in terms of kind of benefits and risks, and looking for do the benefits outweigh the risks? And I think we've seen this in the history of psychiatry as well. Just because the benefits may outweigh the risks doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about the risks. So, it's kind of like it doesn't cancel out the risks. In terms of the scientific hubris, I got a lot from the previous panel. I hope you. It was really good. And I was thinking about, the opposition, like the way in which kind of in indigenous practices, there's a lot of systematic inquiry, aka smart science with a small s. And a lot of the scientific, the clinical work can obviously be seen as involving ritual, as involving performativity and so on. So it kind of gets nice and kind of complicated. But when science meets industry, and you kind of get, I don't know what we want to call that, big pharma meets big science or something like that, then a lot of stuff kind of happens. So personally, I love psychedelics. I think they're amazing and super potent and interesting, wonderful substances. But I don't think that they are in any way the naturally meant to be medications within the Western mental health kind of context, So we're making them into something. And so we've got to be really kind of think about how these substances, which in some ways we might think of as very unruly or weird, are being made into these controllable, harnessable substances that will do a thing, something around kind of healing. And the other thing I'm quite committed to is the idea, I think it's been raised already, that if psychedelics kind of enter mental health care, in some way they change mental health care. But I'm super suspicious of that. Just a couple of minutes remaining, if I do. One thing that's major that we've seen today is this massive reliance on the randomized controlled trial. And I think there's a massive over-reliance on the randomized controlled trial, or RCT, to give us the truth, you know? There have been loads of issues, and if you follow psychedelic science or you're interested in following it, I'd recommend kind of getting into it, some of these issues around the blinding within the research, huge expectancy issues, controlling the massive degrees of freedom that the therapists operating within these trials have. Like, do we manualize it? Do we not manualize it? If we don't manualize it, how do we make meaningful kind of generalizations, you know? The sample sizes are small, super homogeneous. And then you find loads of stuff you find more widely within psychiatry, the kind of questionable research practices and how data is analyzed. That happens a lot in psychedelic research. It does happen more broadly, but it's a real problem in psychedelic research. Ghostwriting, how journals are not likely to publish negative results. So you kind of get this, what in psychology and the sciences, it's called the replicability crisis right now. In RCTs, and we can talk more about RCTs if we want to, but they've really become this dominant technology for ascertaining kind of what works and what doesn't in clinical research. Basically, since 1962, it has this whole kind of history to it. But when you do RCTs as scientists, you're not some kind of neutral, you know, there's this, I liked in the previous panel this idea of the scientist as kind of set up maybe against the shaman, or, you know, it's this kind of dynamic, dramatic kind of image of the scientist. There's another image of the scientist, which is as the bureaucrat, right? The one who's always in committees, the one who's always negotiating, having to find the middle ground, so on. So, and I think part of what science is about is being strategic. And what do you measure? What you measure is what you see. What don't you measure? What you don't measure is what you don't see, right? So that's a kind of real issue with kind of psychedelic RCTs. There's a kind of there's this idea that it's down the line, it's in the real world data. Once this stuff gets approved, then we start to see the kind of, then we can actually see like kind of the more nuanced adverse effects. Actually, we can see a lot of this stuff already. And if you speak to people who have been involved in trials, they will have like good insight into like, well, actually, as a trial guide, as a trial therapist, I did, you know, I saw all these kind of issues, but that's not what gets written up in the journals, you know, and the qualitative research in the journals gets kind of, is sort of superseded by the quantitative research as well. So there are all these kinds of issues. Could I just take 30 seconds? Yeah, okay. Well, I'm just, also once these things are approved, there's a kind of the whole post-approval regulation situation is a mess, so we could talk about that if you'd like to. I wanted to talk about 3 other things. That was just one thing what I just said, so I'll just say what they are. One is like how massively underplayed the relational aspects of psychotherapy are. Here you've got issues of like guide abuse coming up, as we've seen recently, for those of you who are following, so Megan Buisson and this kind of stuff within the kind of Cover Story podcast, heightened suggestibility, that this kind of idea that we can develop these packages where there isn't a connection with the therapist beforehand, so very non-relational approaches. And then just to say the last 2 points, which maybe we'll come back to, is a massive lack of genuinely interdisciplinary research and a massive lack, and this came up in the previous panel, of genuinely participatory research, like folding in stakeholders, including, of course, indigenous communities, but also former trial participants. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks, Tehseen. And lastly, Ashleigh.
That is a hard act to follow. Hi, I'm Ashleigh. I am involved in a lot of this problematic research and can confirm there are real problems about it. So I am a trainee clinical psychologist. I'm a mindfulness instructor. I work as a therapist with people who are very traumatized, as well as being involved in the clinical research with psilocybin. So I'm today talking from the perspective of a trauma-informed therapist when I'm looking at safety and danger in psychedelic therapies. So I think the first thing that I wanted to say is that even in ordinary talking therapy, there are risks. So I can't cover them all, but if I just give you a few to give you an idea, as Tehseen was saying, it's a very relational process. You have a lot of relational risks. If you imagine people are opening themselves up to you, they're also opening themselves up to painful past experiences, painful past memories. And that means there's a risk that things feel a lot worse before they feel better. There's a risk of re-traumatization. We know that suicidal thoughts can increase. We know that relationships in clients' lives can break down because people change in the course of therapy, and sometimes the people in their life don't accommodate that change. There's also a very real risk, as Tehseen said, of emotional or sexual abuse from therapists. So we do have some data on that in ordinary talking therapies. So around 10% of therapists admit to having been sexually involved with one of their clients, and about 26% of patients report that they've had a sexual relationship with their therapist. So when you take into account that those are just some of the risks that you can expect in ordinary talking therapy, it suddenly seems kind of bizarre to think that in psychedelic therapy the risks would be any less than that. Adding a psychedelic into therapy, into that therapy mix, obviously isn't going to make those risks disappear. And what actually happens is that it amplifies those usual risks that we expect. It, I think, makes some of them more likely to happen in some circumstances, in some contexts, and also adds in unique, new, different risk factors that we need to think about as well. So I wonder if quite a lot of therapists might agree and might assess that the risk, the therapeutic, the relational risks and the therapeutic risks in psychedelic therapy are maybe higher than in ordinary talking therapy. But what you'll see written everywhere, and what you'll see everyone, or maybe hear everyone talking about, or at least that's what I hear a lot of, is psychedelics are safe when taken in carefully controlled clinical settings. So this statement I see a lot and I hear a lot. And in a way, it's true. And in another way, it's kind of misleading. So what does seem to be true is that compared to completely unregulated, uncontrolled use of psychedelics in underground settings or recreational use, the risk is lower in clinical settings than in therapy settings. But what that doesn't mean is that it's completely safe or that there are no risks, because obviously being kind of lower risk or it being safer isn't the same as being completely risk-free. And I think that this blurring of kind of lines has happened because we're joining these two different things up. So we're joining up psychedelics as medicines, but psychedelics with all of their kind of, everything that comes with them, all the amazing things that come with them, and therapy. So they're two distinct things. We're putting them together in one therapy package. And in a way, that's really confusing. And I think we might need to separate them out a little bit to kind of really have a look in greater depth and complexity at what's going on in terms of risk and experiences of people. The psychedelic part, the therapy part, and the interaction between those. So, we keep asking this question, is it safe to take psychedelics? And I think the question we actually really need to be asking is, how does introducing a psychedelic into a therapy process affect the potential risk of harm that we know already exists for the clients that we're working with in therapy? Because if we then, if we actually acknowledge that, then we can start actually dealing with the risks and minimizing some of the potential harm that comes from those risks. So we can start to say, okay, when we give somebody a psychedelic, they enter into a more suggestible state because of changes that are happening in the brain. So that means that they become more open and potentially more likely to believe whatever we say to them as therapists, which then also opens them up to a greater potential of abuse or manipulation from therapists, or just, even something not as extreme as that, but just being given misinformation or being directed in the agenda of the therapist rather than their own direction. And we might, so if we actually kind of acknowledge that and look at that, we might actually start to think about what do we need to do in each of the phases of psychedelic therapy in order to actually protect clients' autonomy through the process so that people maintain their sense of autonomy and control throughout. We can start to think about the risk of re-traumatization and the fact that people are likely to relive traumatic memories, and the fact that people do experience recovering repressed memories that they weren't aware of, usually of abuse. And so we can start to then actually assess how often does that happen? What's it actually like for somebody when that happens? How do we support somebody if that does happen? So we can start to make it safer. Importantly, we can face the allegations and disclosures of sexual misconduct that have happened in psychedelic therapy. When it's happened in the past, so in the kind of earlier research, therapists started guiding in twos. That was a measure that was put in place, and with male and female therapist dyads to try and reduce the risk of sexual misconduct. But the reality is that sexual misconduct has now happened in a modern psychotherapy clinical trial context with a male and female therapist guiding pair. And so I think we just have to ask ourselves whether we think that's really enough, or whether there are things that we need to be thinking about, or different ways that we can be interacting with this issue that can create a greater sense of safety for our clients. And I think if we give ourselves permission to look at the risks honestly, we can make the treatment safe and effective. I really do feel very hopeful and very confident about that, actually. And suppose then I just want to finish by saying that as we look at all of the risks and we kind of ask ourselves to look at these difficult questions, that there's a risk that we start to sensationalize or overhype the dangers that are there in psychedelic therapy as well. And I think it's actually a balance to honestly look without overplaying or minimizing. And I think if we're willing to acknowledge the truth of, just the truth of it, and approach the practice of introducing psychedelics into psychotherapy with humility, with a lot of respect for our clients and the people coming to have this treatment, and with a lot of willingness to learn as well. That with that, we can actually learn how to do this the wrong way to say it, how to offer these treatments in a way that is safe and that is effective and that a lot of people could benefit from.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Wow, so lots to chew over out of all four discussions. I'd just like to add one other element, which is which I think everyone here is involved with to some degree as well, which is communication. Just recently I've been reading and writing about the LSD and chromosome scare in the late 1960s, which has many different facets to it, but in the first place there's some bad peer review, which got some articles included, which was then picked up by the media press that told people they were going to have children with mutated chromosomes and this sort of thing. One of the journal responses was by Abraham Hoffer, who worked with Osmond and Smithies on some of the 50s research, and he says we're in danger of both being too positive about the efficacy and too positive about the dangers as well, and there's a danger of pushing both of these things which give a false narrative of what's going on, and I wonder how the communication is able to temper some of the newer problems which are emerging compared to the public expectations at the same time. I don't know if anyone has any comments on that. Perhaps what you see your roles are as communicators as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's why it comes back to really weighing up the benefits and risks, but also I think what's very key, taking things slowly and admitting, like humility basically, admitting there are loads of uncertainties, there are things we don't know yet, maybe we will never know with the current science, I don't know. And also I loved what you said, Ashleigh, in terms of therapy or talking therapy has a lot of issues, and then you put psychedelics where we don't have all the answers either in the mix, so that can be quite a volatile mix as well. So I think it's absolutely key for us to pay attention to it, take things slowly, and we're actually involved in hopefully working towards ethical guidelines in that respect further. And so the slight risk I see in that is that a lot of the big companies don't necessarily want to wait for all that. They want to move faster, and they have their product or their substance, and so now it's been patented, it's getting ready. So I think the risk here is really not taking things slow enough and cautiously enough, whilst also obviously highlighting that these are hopefully very important medications which can be added to Western psychiatry as well as other medical conditions.
Yeah, with the HPPD issue, it's a really complicated one, because as I mentioned in my introductory comments, this isn't, the experiences pointed to by HPPD needn't be pathologized, and especially with heightened suggestibility after psychedelic experiences, and the fact that some form of visual effect in the days after a trip might be relatively normal. What I've been scared of is the idea of just raising the alarm about the possibility of these effects, when really through the act of communication and through a sort of looping effect, you can almost give people the condition. This is a real concern I've had, but at the same time, what I'd also like to do is expand the brackets of the kinds of risks we discuss. Because there's this line that psychedelics are non-toxic, non-addictive. And whilst I'll start with the addictive element, because whilst psychedelics clearly aren't addictive in the same way that, for example, opioid painkillers are, I think the fact that the conversation is sort of shut off and stifled discussion about dependency. And a phrase that Jamie Wheal uses a lot, which resonates with me, is the idea of ontological addiction, that the bliss and the sense of insight and sometimes the sheer escapism of a positive psychedelic experience can be psychologically addictive. And I believe that this psychological addiction is actually relatively, or at least more common than we think. And something that the Stanford psychiatrist Anna Lemke told me, which was quite illuminating, was that the primary symptoms of addiction are not physical. They're actually psychological, especially a sense of preoccupation with past experiences, constantly thinking about them, constantly thinking about your next trip, etc. And I'm not saying that psychological or ontological dependency is necessarily the majority experience, but I think that it's more common than we think, and that certain conversational norms and taboos have emerged, and also the non-toxic element. And I'm not an expert on the specifics of human physiological function or the specific definition of toxicity, but when you think of something like HPPD, clearly there's something neurophysiological going on here. You take a powerful drug like LSD, and these are effects that can also be created by SSRIs as well. It seems to be a broad and generalized serotonergic effect. You can, it seems, permanently alter your visual cortex through psychedelics. And this is something that I don't see discussed enough. And then recently I began sort of looking at the overlaps of HPPD with other conditions, and I was struck by the overlap of HPPD with epilepsy, with occipital and temporal lobe epilepsy in terms of dissociative effects, geometric pseudo-hallucinations. And then when you look on online fora, you see that people report seizure episodes on psychedelics not infrequently. And then I was struck to receive a note recently from a lady who had a seizure episode after taking a microdose, and this was 2 months after a very heavy trip that traumatized her. She took a microdose, and she has lived with this extremely broad physical, psychological, traumatic, neurological dysfunction ever since. And I think that there are certain cases at the boundaries of our culture that haven't been properly researched. And I think that perhaps more than anything, we haven't properly accepted the implications of the shutdown in research. That is, that there was shut down for, let's say, 40 years into the possible therapeutic benefits of psychedelics. But at the same time, because of stigma, people concealing what happened to them, and also just sheer lack of research into what these drugs do and how they affect the mind and the nervous system, we don't know their benefits as well as their costs, speaking very crudely. And I'm optimistic that I can play a role in motivating research into these quite physical possible side effects.
I mean, with this is sort of getting to the core of what I was thinking about it. So you've got this possible risk and danger involved in them. How do you think that is most beneficially communicated, not only to other researchers, but also to the wider public, especially the wider public who are becoming recreationally probably more interested as a result of everything else that's going on as well? I don't know if you guys have anything to say on that.
So what was the question? How would you?
Well, yeah, how would you communicate it? Yeah.
Do you want?
I can go after.
Well, I feel like my role in all of this is a bit of a strange one because in some way, because like you're both very public facing, I would say. Ed, you do a lot of journalism work, and within that outfit that you work with, I'm a social science researcher, so we have these perennial worries that no one reads what we write, so they're academic journals or whatever. But in terms of how one would communicate, I'm trying to think of an interesting thing to say. I would say that for those of us who are trained in methodologies, and my big kind of thing around this is like to be more vigilant around methodology. Like, how do we know what we know? I think in the last panel there was some talk about epistemology. Mm-hmm. For me, methodology is really interesting. And for those of us who are trained in something like ethnography, right? So a kind of immersion within cultures to learn from the perspective of from within cultures, to be able to see it in a different way from the outside, etc. When something like scientific researchers and research communities are your subcultures that you're interested in, but also people experimenting in the underground or whatever. For me, one thing that I've learned is that when I do that kind of research, I build community. I'm already connecting with people. I connect people to other people, you know? I've had a book on the back burner, which I think is Ed, you made me think of, about kind of connecting psychedelics and the broader field of neurodiversity and madness and kind of people who have these unusual but stigmatized and often pathologized experiences. And that book is just like, who's going to read that book? I mean, maybe lots of people. But in the process of doing it, we ran a conference. We ended up running a conference. It was kind of random a year ago, called Psychedelics, Madness and Awakening. It's all archived online. There's some participants who are here. I advise you to check that out if you're interested. But yeah, like, so stuff like that, running conferences, doing events, that is building community. And that's very different than like writing an article that then goes on Medium and you hope that will change lots of people's minds. But to me, it's a much richer, thicker way of getting like nuanced conversations going, because it happens through friendship, through trust, through the kind of thing that I think, like, against the kind of big pharma model, which we're seeing more and more of, which I think of as scalability. It's kind of cookie cutter, like, you know, you get the formula and then you smash it out everywhere. For me, in contrast to scalability, it's about growth. It's about something that's organic and grows outwards, right? It moves at the speed of trust, it's community building, etc. So that, for me, is like a different way of thinking about what communication could mean and be.
A few things are coming up for me around communication. Something that you were talking about there around kind of community and getting information out kind of with conferences and things like that. And what comes to mind is that I've been running an integration sharing circle for the last year or so, and there are a few different groups running integration sharing circles around London. And they are, I think, a great way to get information out about, rather than kind of a top-down approach, but it's just like peers in a community sharing information about, this has been my psychedelic experience, this has been mine, and people learn from each other. And I think that's a really nice way. I'm very suspicious, although I'm kind of in mental health and in therapy, I'm very suspicious of models and I'm kind of critical of that kind of approach. And I think what's so amazing about psychedelics is that they free our minds and they give us kind of a potential to kind of, free up parts of ourselves and regain access to them and to think in new ways. So I think a way that I like to see the integration circles running is to offer a plurality of ideas, to let people really explore and think about different things and come to their own understandings of what psychedelics are, because I think there are a lot of different psychedelic communities within the whole space, and I think that's what's so rich as well.
So I agree, I fully agree with you. But if you also think of communication kind of to the wider public or people who might be interested, I mean, psychedelic medicine seem to be everywhere at the moment, in Forbes, in Tatler, in Vogue. I mean, you just open the normal newspaper and they're there. And some of this reporting actually is done quite well, I think. Others not, as you could expect, and so on. So I think it is really our job as well, and we kind of, within our kind of organization, we do like to do this, to communicate the scientific findings, and with scientific, by the way, I also mean kind of qualitative, not just the science, in a kind of accessible manner, writing a blog, putting it out there, hopefully being responsive to questions, and so on. And I think that's kind of our duty. I see it as scientists as well, that these scientific papers actually get brought further and are communicated in the way we would like to see them, including the benefits, the risks, and most importantly, also the uncertainties, I think.
Could I just to add something in and maybe break the order or break the Q&A thing a bit, just to connect up some thoughts. Like, I was thinking about how I love this thing about peer support, and that speaks to the wider kind of psychiatric survivor, just mental health service user kind of worlds. But thinking about that peer support as a kind of community building, to me connects to what Ed, you were saying something about addiction. Because it's like, this is, I think, part of what's so wondrous about these experiences and these substances, is that one does become really interested in them. And from a more maybe anthropological perspective, I like to think that you can invert it. And instead of thinking about that as something that's potentially really bad, a kind of addiction, like, to use the mental health language, if it's functional, blah, 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 if you can still do your job, whatever, if it's not distressing, then it can be a way of life. It can be something that you really want. You start coming to conferences on Saturdays when you want to be with your mates. Like there are people here, I think I've spotted a few, who have been doing this stuff for decades, and it's really valuable to them. So it's beautiful to think that there's something that is almost of the quality of like being addicted, but that's such a loaded, awful term, right? But a commitment to something that has emerged around psychedelics that is productive of peers, of community, of deeper ways of knowing that continue to extend outwards. So I quite like that idea.
Yeah, I would agree with Tehseen that attending conferences isn't necessarily symptomatic of addiction. But I would say that above all, what I'd like to do is criticize, or in the social science language, problematize the idea that these are non-toxic, non-addictive. Because at the very least, it's too simplistic. Because whilst there will be what a psychiatrist or certain psychiatrists might diagnose as a sort of dysfunctional preoccupation with psychedelic experiences, Tehseen might say, might just be, this is very interesting material to think about. At the same time, I think that to use a definition of addiction I've seen Gebel Mate uses, and I'm not sure of its utility, but I'll use it here, which is that you continue to use a substance even though you know it's actually producing you net harm. And a sort of inability to, or a reduced ability to sort of commit to your, and again, this is very loaded language, but commit to your life in the so-called real world. And again, this is all very loaded, but I think that there are very real conversations to be had about these problems with psychedelics, and that the idea of addiction is loaded, but I think that it is real. And I think that it overlaps with the HPPD issue, because you'll have people that, and this is myself included to an extent, was that I was so awestruck by my psychedelic experiences when I was at school, that despite having developed often quite distressing visual symptoms, when I got to university, I was like, yeah, I want to continue tripping. And a lot of people in the HPPD world, they're drawn back to tripping. And often it doesn't end too well. And especially if you have a lot of time on your hands, you find yourself tripping quite a lot. And that doesn't often end too well. And indeed, the dissociative disorder I developed was from a university experience. And that brings to mind something else, is that I think there are particular risks associated with peak experiences, the ego dissolution experience, that I don't think we necessarily discuss enough. And maybe this is more like sort of 2017, 2018 psychedelia, when ego death was on everyone's minds. And I thought, yeah, that's awesome. My objective is to live in a state of constant egolessness. I was reading my Alan Watts, and I thought, this is going to be, I'm going to beat the final boss. But then at the same time, this dissociative disorder didn't manifest till a year later, when I started sort of re-entering this egoless state under stress. And this is something I still struggle with quite frequently. And that brings to mind another thing, which is that I think that the risks, so to speak, or the dangers of psychedelic experience don't necessarily manifest themselves quickly. I think they can occur over the long term. And I've heard of people who have had depression, for example, having a mushroom trip, and there's an immediate surge. My depression's gone. And then 3-4 weeks later, and that lasts 3-4 weeks, and then 5-6 months later, you start grappling with some of the questions raised. And that's when depression can return, often with a vengeance. So it's complicated stuff.
Yeah, I think the part of the narrative of the danger as well is quite odd. I mean, Sidney Cohen did this work in the 60s, and I think some organisations have done it more recently, reviewing the dangers of the literature in the 50s and 60s. But there's two problems with doing that. One, most of the research wasn't reported anywhere, so we don't actually have a very good gauge of what was going on. Especially in the United States, people were very privately doing all kinds of different things. And on the other side of that, we actually know that some psychiatrists were doing very, very unethical things, like William Sargent doing like blitz therapies and layering LSD up with electroconvulsive therapy and stuff. But all their research on it is actually under lock and key. And as a historian, I'm not allowed to go and see their files for like an 80-year period. So it's really very difficult to create the narrative of safety when actually most of the information isn't even there, which I think raises the question for what's happening today, because that's what we now have to redo. We have to get re-access to information we did have and now don't have access to. And I don't know with some of your researchers, especially the clinical work, whether it is literally going back to basics or there is much to draw on when you're looking at dangers.
Trying to avoid it. So the question is there much to draw on when thinking about dangers in the work? So I suppose that we are lucky in that there are still some therapists who are training therapists who've been doing the work for a really long time. So I'm thinking of Bill Richards, who trained our team, and also people like Mark Ajala, who much younger but have been doing very extensive work and have a lot of experience. So I think that clinical experience is absolutely invaluable because the dangers do come through in that, and protocols have been kind of made for the clinical trial research protocols, kind of bearing that clinical experience in mind. Saying that, the research that I'm doing is to analyse the therapy sessions from the psilocybin for depression trial that I worked on, and to look for experiences of challenge, and to see what that is like. And so in a way that is really going back to basics, isn't it? And when I try and do a literature search to see what's out there, it's very difficult to find very much written about it. Obviously there's kind of the notion of the challenging experience is very prevalent in the literature. So kind of there's a questionnaire measure now that's been created assessing states of intense fear and despair and hopelessness and those kind of intense emotional states. So there is and a big part of how, one of the theories of how psychedelics might be having an effect is that the challenging experience is actually therapeutic and might lead to a kind of a letting go, an emotional catharsis, an emotional breakthrough, and then kind of coming through on the other side. And I think that in my clinical experience, that trajectory does happen for some people, but it's not uncomplicated for everyone. And for other people, the trajectories look quite different. They're much more up and down. There's a lot more going on between sessions. So I think, yes, I think we can draw on the clinical experience of those experienced researchers, and that's invaluable. And we've got to do quite a lot of going back to basics now as well. It's both.
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well in terms of obviously scientific publication and scientific research, I would like to think, and I'm sure there's plenty of things we can do even better, but the transparency that we actually have to do these days, or the publishing of the actual protocols and so on, and getting critique for it and developing the protocol to make it better and hopefully safer. So there's a lot going on really in the background, and which these days is available. Fully agree that it probably isn't available from decades ago, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. But then I'm not sure how much of that is available from the kind of corporate research that's being done. I think a lot of that is sort of much more under lock and key. And that's kind of one of the main things, like in a way we can have a nuanced conversation here, because to the extent that the clinical scientists, at least so far in the conversation today, are here, they're not kind of speaking on behalf of, the pharma corporations and so on. So yeah, there are kind of maybe two different kinds of clinical research that we should sort of pay attention to. But I wanted to ask you actually, Ashleigh, about so you said that you're looking at these participant experience reports, and I wondered how much of a shame is it? How much is lost? But maybe there isn't too much from not knowing also the situating those reports more relationally and knowing, well, what were the experiences of the guides and the therapists at that moment as well, like I really like thinking about how we can think differently about clinical trials, including, of course, how we can sort of measure more in different sort of things. But one thing is this, like, and I think this came up in the previous panel, real focus on the self who needs to be healed or cured or whatever, you know. But if you think about these things as deeply relational, then it's like there's this whole kind of theatrical performance of the clinical trial that's going on, and then the reporting on it is like a game on a game, you know? It's a second level of like, you just look at the individuals and you get, even experience reports, I think is great, and that's what I did when I was working at a trial, was like getting qualitative research, and it's so valuable. But if you don't know what the context within which those experiences were being reported, you also don't know how much work behind the scenes were the study therapists or other people in the staff and the team doing to kind of help that person out, to help that person make sense of stuff, that sort of thing. So that sort of fuller picture, are we missing it? How can we get it? That sort of thing.
I think you're spot on. And so I was part of the team, so I have some of that information. And the study is a two-phase study. So the first phase is looking at therapy sessions, and phase 2 is interviewing therapists. So therapists who are involved in those relational reactions, but also other therapists beyond who've had their own experiences of challenges in the therapy. Because it is deeply relational, I think we do need to be looking exactly like you're saying at both sides, and really understanding what's going on in the relationship.
That's so cool. That's really cool that's happening, yeah. I think in some of those bigger studies, like I come to mind the kind of Compass study where I feel like the training was, other people can probably speak to this better than me, was very minimal. You know, the guides were being churned out. This is the yang energy that I think Natasha was speaking about before. They're kind of being churned out. It's not, you know, it's such less depth of kind of training and so on. And then this sort of relational component gets lost. Like if in the wash, the average treatment effects get way down, but they're still slightly better than the comparator, then suddenly it goes on the market, you know, and we've got this kind of crappy therapy from this, what could be really profound kind of experiences. And then of course the response is that, well, then we can start to experiment once it's been approved, it's Trojan horse, blah, blah, blah. But it's like what gets baked in along the way as kind of norms. Anyway, the questions go on, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly, but I was going to exactly get back to this whole, the big pharma development model, basically, which we're seeing again and again. And in terms of losing out on lots, basically drug developers looking at the product, something they can patent and they can use and prescribe as soon as possible. And most of them, unfortunately, are not looking at the process, which is exactly what Ashleigh said, and which might have, for example, helped your friend with depression as well. If you have integration, if you have sufficient aftercare, you can at least deal and address these kind of issues in a way, hopefully, that they don't become permanent or so long-term, you know, that they remain transient, as we know from lots of psychedelic effects. So I think that's one thing we should really keep in mind as one of the dangers in relation to psychedelics.
Oh, great, thank you very much. So we're into the last third now, so we're going to throw some questions out to you, wonderful audience. I think there's a couple of mics being taken around, if I'm right. So please do keep your questions concise, and I will cut you off if they're not.
We're going to be really nepotistic and give it to Cam.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, you two take those ones.
Actually, you brought up the idea of suggestibility in the clinical place, and I want to sort of tie that back to the previous discussion before you guys. And I'm wondering if we can learn something from the sacred chapel type thing. This for all of you, I just want to bounce this into you. So there's agendas. They may be covert, they may be overt. In a religious context, they're overt. And it becomes a lifestyle and a process over time. In the clinic, it's covert. There's what I'm sort of getting at is like when you join a religious community, you are engaging in informed consent. Whereas if you give consent to a clinical thing and there's a covert agenda, is that informed? Is that consent informed? And so this relational stuff with the guide, relational aspects with guides, can we minimize harm by learning from the chapel by having that informed consent? This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it, as opposed to it's a healing substance.
Yeah.
So it's that into the
I think it's a general
It's for any of
question.
us. For any of us.
I've just been speaking.
Me too. I can do it.
Yeah, okay, we can do it.
I'll do it. We can do it.
Can you restate the question, Cam?
Oh no, we can do it. We can do it.
We do.
Yeah,
I just didn't want to take up. I didn't want to take all the space.
It's just really about batting back to you the idea of informed consent and having a more lifestyle process and understanding what the agenda of the practitioner is, as opposed to this false objectivity that comes in a clinical trial and in a scientific process of healing.
Yeah. So I think to that last part that you just spoke about, the kind of covert, overt agendas. I think that so I think it's almost this blurring of psychedelics and therapy as all one thing, and that there aren't distinct processes kind of going on, that kind of gives rise to that covert agenda, or gives greater rise. But in reality, you are getting informed consent to the therapy because there's a therapy. Well, yeah, no, you're not always, and that's really a problem. So in ordinary talking therapy, you are getting informed consent. You know, really, I talk to people, and I guess you do also, Cam, with counselling, like, this is what the therapy will involve. This is what you can expect. This is what we know evidence-wise happens for people. And then people make a decision whether they want to go ahead with that or a different way of doing it. And it's not completely informed because obviously we're always drawing on more than one theory, probably. But there is like that attempt at consent. And I think if we make more explicit, like you're saying, the what is the therapy part of this? What therapy models are we giving to people, and why are we saying this is a good idea or not? Because they are more suggestible. So if our model is wrong, then people take that on wholeheartedly. And of course, we are always learning. You know, therapy is constantly updating and changing and renewing. So yeah, it's really problematic. Yeah, maybe I'll hand over also to
Well, let's move on to another question.
Okay.
So we get another one. Can I have another question?
Should we sort of do it going round, like fairly round the room?
Yeah.
I can't see who did their hand first, but someone had a hand.
Hello there. I'm Sam. I'm one of the many volunteers on site today from PsyCare. Whoop whoop. You'll see us at the after party later. I've also drug checked with the loop and have a bit of experience in the lab. So I wanted to thank you for your lived experience. And one point you brought up of seeing symptoms online of people describing things. So in my research experience, studying novel psychoactive substances, which hadn't necessarily been studied yet, our first point of call was looking at symptoms online, having a trip report of someone who just bought this drug, imported it from Poland or the Czech Republic, and took it, and then found out, you know, their fingers started falling asleep and their tingly fingers. That was an indication for us that we had to look at, you know, whether their blood flow was restricted. So it's the first step there. I mentioned Psycho in the loop because of the innate risks with any drug use that we run into at festivals all the time. And I'm very grateful that we are in a place where we can turn people's experience around, where we can turn it into something beneficial. But at the same time, I think there is always scope for putting more information out there. I appreciate Drug Science does that, both in your more formal blogs, both in the formal papers you put out, and recently your stuff on Instagram with drug info, pill reports, and having it be approachable to young people. So my question for all of you, especially taking some of the clinical experience, some of the lived experience, is how to get more of that information out there. So it isn't necessarily all this lived experience that we have in this room right now that people have gained through hundreds or thousands of trips, but turn it into information that we can give to someone who is a first-time user, who's a second-time user, and make them a bit more informed about their use before they start, without putting too many ideas in their head, like telling them they could have a quote-unquote bad trip, and then as soon as they hit anxiety, thinking they're now having this awful experience, rather than something they don't learn. So yeah, lots of information. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. What comes to mind specifically is, of course, the thing I specialise in, which is HPPD. And one issue is I don't really know what to tell people when they ask me. I might have a conversation with someone who's psychedelic novice, and they're like, oh, how can I prevent that happening? And on the one hand, I think that in order to produce high quality information, what needs to happen is there to be proper research before we pump stuff out to the public. I mean, given that the issue I mentioned earlier, which is that we can almost loop people into this condition through suggestibility effects. And also, we have no idea of the predispositions to HVPD, really, or the specific conditions under which these visuals are become intense, why they're intense to some people and why they're not for others, why they're distressing to some people and why they're not distressing for others, and what the non-visual symptoms might be. And so with all these things in mind, I'm often just like, yeah, if these effects come up for you, just be aware that this is a possibility. Give people some informed consent, and then try not to be freaked out if it happens, and speak to people. But then more generally, there is quite a sizable HVPD community online, and with this, there is effort ongoing the last couple of years to produce an HVPD documentary, and we hope to have this out by the end of the year at least, which will have scientists, researchers, people with lived experience of the condition, and I hope that with this long-form format, we could give it, the HVPD issue the subtlety but immediacy that it deserves.
Can I just add to that? It was a really good question. One thing that comes to my mind is when I look at all these different practices, especially from the scientific psychiatry point of view, over a long period of time, it becomes more of a cultural history. Things come in and out of fashion depending on what the current beliefs are. I worked for a couple of festivals with PsyCare several years ago, and I learned more in those sessions about looking after and helping people than I'd done by reading hundreds of papers. So I think organisations like that should be putting out their own literature, and getting places like this to disseminate it would be really, really useful.
That's cool.
There's a question down there, and then we're going to go up here afterwards, but if Tehseen wants to...
Also, to second that, that's a really nice point. And you know, like in a lot of ways, like this kind of idea of pharmacovigilance, like looking at what happens once drugs are approved in the kind of general population. In relation to psychedelics, that's already happening. It's like you're saying, it's people kind of go online, it's all there. There's a nice kind of paper that was written by Nicholas Langlitz, the anthropologist, about 10 years ago about this, like black market pharmacovigilance, which is kind of, I recommend. But yeah, in terms of like switching over to harm reduction a little bit, like there's also, for example, the Fireside Project, who I work with a little bit in the US and doing a research project with them right now. But they're a peer support psychedelic warm line or peer support line for people who are tripping or who have tripped or are holding space or who have held space to kind of process stuff. And I believe I heard from someone that something like that may be coming here, right? So with this idea of a kind of peer support line is a long-standing thing within kind of more broadly within kind of mental health as well. So yeah, just do
another question. Thanks.
Okay, sorry to speak again. I was in the previous panel, but just very briefly. First of all, I think it's really timely. It's the bubble bursting period we're in with a panel like this, a theme like this, and really important inputs and suggestions. I think is very valuable. I think, by the way, that everybody is partly to blame from having, to some degree, left out some of the negative aspects and risk early on, because this was sort of breaking down walls and reintroducing the science and the testing and putting them back, and therefore it has been a very optimistic, positive narrative, and now it's so timely to zooming in on some of the tricky aspects and potential risky things. And just to also follow up on Ashleigh saying that she's looking at challenging risk, that's one out of, I think, around 5 projects ongoing now in our team at Imperial, zooming in on different negative aspects. So we also have that focus. Actually, it's ongoing. And then when Ashleigh mentioned repressed memory, I personally find that slightly tricky because it insinuates that it's real memory. And with regard to these experiences evoking maybe sometimes symbolic representation of a lot of different materials, then coming up in a session, is that repressed? It could be a mix of a lot of things, and it could come out in a form where it's more like dreamlike, and there's a lot of responsibility sitting with a therapist working on that. I think that's a really tricky thing. I also think that it needs to be integrated into the consent process, because I think it's extremely important. So I think we also got to tighten up on that and zoom in and try to describe it from the data we have. When it comes to HPPD,
sorry to cut you short, have you got a specific question?
Yeah, HPPD, could that be, since it's not seen in trials, it's not reported at least, could it be that some degree of PTSD, that it's because of the maybe not being integrated, that it's a traumatic experience that then manifests a bit like reappearing, reliving nightmares, and so on?
One thing I'd like to say is that we now know from the Power Trip podcast that HPPD style, although the visual effects described by this participant were very dissimilar to a classic HPPD profile, so to speak, but visual effects did occur in the MAPS MDMA trial among one of the participants interviewed in this podcast, although these were not reported in the write-up. I think that there certainly can be a traumatic component to HPPD, although it's complicated by the fact that HPPD is kind of almost let down by its definition, especially in the DSM, as a kind of re-experiencing of psychedelic symptoms, when it's actually far more complicated as a visual syndrome. But what I'd add is that in the most common HPPD profile is when the visuals are basically constant, like your entire visual perception has been altered in a quasi-psychedelic or unusual direction. And therefore it doesn't occur in PTSD-style flashbacks. But I would suspect that certain people who have what's styled as HPPD flashbacks, and this has occurred and that's happened to me, it might be something like PTSD. And it makes me think of how I'm not sure I think that there could be very interesting work to be done in really researching the far-reaching possibilities of a bad trip. And I've seen, with the lady I described earlier, physical symptoms, psychological symptoms. I'm not an expert on trauma, but I'd be interested to see work on how wide-ranging the possibilities of simply trauma can be, and psychedelics then as a trigger or vessel for trauma.
Another question? I think there's some down here as well, Amy.
Yeah, hi. I'm Clara. I live in London, but I'm coming from Czech Republic, and I work for Beyond Psychedelics, which is a non-profit organization. And we are now running courses for public, which are trying to educate people, like when people who are interested in like first use of psychedelics or who has friends with a challenging experience. And we are trying to prevent bad trips, and it's all like things we don't want them to experience. So my question is, if there in UK or London are courses for public like this?
I'm not sure about courses per se, if that's the right word, but for example, what Tehseen already referred to, the fireside chat, so the availability of a reasonably trained therapist who's there to help before, during, and after trip as well. And in terms of education, we at Drug Science also have quite a lot of webinars offering free for the public, as well as our drug info slides about all different types of psychedelics as well as other drugs, of course, but really, you know, a lot of detail, and where both benefits and risk are outlined in quite great detail, all from a pharmacological perspective as well as in sometimes social and ethical risks and so on.
Can I just a real quick, I think point of clarification, the Fireside Project, they're not therapists.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a kind of
but
peer
they are
support
trained,
line.
aren't they?
There's a little bit of training, but I think that difference is really important in terms of kind of the professionalization of all of this versus what's super valuable about peer support, which I think maybe comes back to the point about from the psyche guy.
I have another question.
He's got a second mic there.
Hi, I've just arrived.
Interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I've been living in Costa Rica for the last 2 years and just arrived 2 days ago. And one of the question that I had is I've been watching what people are now referring to as Costa Rica as the psychedelic wonderland. And my big concern after doing many journeys myself and participating in many ceremonies is that now these events are happening in such large numbers. In some of the retreats, up to 150 people doing ayahuasca, psilocybin, whatever the substance is. And what I see, especially because I come back into London, is in that context, firstly people assume the shaman is safe, and then they start to idealise or project onto the shaman that they are an authority figure that has something and a very profound influence in their life. And that actually you talked about the relationship between the therapist and the client. Well, they don't have that directly, they just project onto the shaman. And then there's a lot of abuse that happens in those environments. So my big concern is that people in context go to Costa Rica to experience what they are seeing as either a healing or a transformational experience. They come back into London, and I personally feel a big adjustment coming from the jungle into the city. And I'm qualified, and those people come back in here and they don't know how to make sense of one, that context, to the experience, and then they think that's the answer. So my question in that background, my question is, we are talking about the clinical dangers here, but I think it's not addressed substantially enough or importantly what people think they're going to have as an experience, and they come back and they don't know how to integrate, they haven't got a community, they don't have a fireside chat, and they're being lost. And my real concern is, my question to you, what can be done in terms of communication in London and America and anywhere, because it really is, I think, a serious problem there, where there's not the responsibility of the preparation and the integration process of what's needed. So do you have a solution or a suggestion as to what could happen here in this country when people are returning from those experiences? Whether it's Costa Rica or Brazil or Peru or anywhere.
Thank you for raising such an important consideration. I actually started out working with ayahuasca. I spent time in the jungle and had my own difficult experience returning from the jungle to London. I think this is a huge issue, and I would point to the work of Shakruna Bialabache, who's been doing a lot of work to raise awareness. So she has guidelines online around education for how people can inform themselves about what to look for in an ayahuasca shaman, guide, whatever they call themselves, a kind of some recommendations for places that are safe and things like that. How to disseminate that information more widely here, I think, is tricky, because there are some people who will be here today. Benjamin Mudge is somebody who will be very connected to the ayahuasca community and does a lot of ayahuasca research. So there are networks of people, but I suppose the information probably already reaches those people, and it might be people beyond those communities that it's harder to get to, and that's something I don't have an answer to, but it is something that really needs to be, kind of thought about in terms of dissemination. Does anybody else have ideas of, Psychedelic Society spread a lot of it, but it's the converted.
I agree. I mean, I was going to give a slightly broader perspective, and thank you. You raised a lot of interesting and important issues within your question. Basically, the size of it, the idolization of the shaman, the lack of integration and return and so on. So, a lot of important ones. One thing I think is key, and I think what we can work towards is really, as I said before, really the rescheduling of psychedelics into at least Schedule 2 here in the UK, which would make them a medicine. It would mean people can talk about it more freely. They can go to their doctor, they can speak about it. It is not such a stigma anymore. They haven't participated in an illegal act where they might fear criminalization and so on. So I think that is just as a broader topic. This would be absolutely a key thing for us to develop further. And I think we all have a bit of responsibility here in order to move this further as well.
Can I, real quick? Yeah. just to like, not as a solution, anything like a solution, but more like deepening the problem, is that here I feel like a lot of the discourse around clinical safety, which I think is maybe in itself kind of dangerous, I think a lot of that can be propagated because the people who go through trials, like in the kind of global north or in the western places like London, they're also held in all these invisibilized ways, like by local psychedelic societies or integration groups and so on. So there's this perception that, oh, people are going through trials here and they're doing relatively well, but there's all these ways in which also maybe more affluent, more wealthy kind of demographics, people are kind of being held more. So that discrepancy, which produces this kind of tricky politics of like fetishizing but also demonizing the other, this kind of us versus them kind of thing. That whole thing is animated by the ways partially by the ways in which stuff is invisibilized here, I think. That's it.
I think we've got time for one more really quick question, if someone's got one. Super concise.
Thank you. So, very quickly, as an integration therapist, I've worked with somebody with HPAD, and the presentation did resolve through the process of therapy. So, I think the integration, being able to go to somebody who's worked in that area is really valuable. The one thing that I did notice was they did have a background of trauma, which may have been related. Secondly, they had very vivid mental imagery. So I suspect that could also be something worth looking at in the future.
Okay, well, thank you for the comment. So I think a big round of applause for all of our wonderful speakers. Thank you.